Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to share and subscribe the channel. In the heart of the galaxy, on a distant and ancient world, the Seth Empire stood as one of the most powerful civilizations ever known. With their towering cities and vast starships, they had conquered and dominated countless alien species for centuries. The Seth had ruled unchallenged, their empire sprawling across entire star systems, its power unmatched by any known force. They were intelligent, strategic, and ruthless in their ambition. In their eyes, there was no force in the universe capable of threatening their empire, but there was one thing the Seth Empire did not believe: the legends of humanity. The Seth had long dismissed stories of humans as mere myths, tales passed down from ancient texts, told around campfires and dismissed by scholars as fantasy. The humans, if they ever existed at all, were nothing more than a figment of imagination, a primitive race that had long since faded into history. The elders of the Death Empire laughed whenever someone dared to bring up the human legends, but beneath their laughter, something unsettling began to stir. Strange things were happening in the vastness of the Death Empire's space. The Tithe's long-range scanners, once reliable, began to pick up cryptic signals from the farthest reaches of the galaxy, signals that seemed to defy explanation. Deep space was whispering something. At first, the disturbances were small and unnoticeable. A faint anomaly here, a brief blip there. But soon the signals grew stronger and more frequent, and they were always in the same pattern. The elders, however, ignored the warnings. They were convinced that the humans were nothing more than fairy tales, no more real than the stars themselves. Yet there was one officer who did not dismiss the tales so easily. Kier, a young and ambitious officer in the Teeth Fleet, had always been fascinated by the ancient texts. Unlike his comrades, Kier spent his free time studying the old records, searching for the truth hidden within the myths. He had read the stories of the human fleet, of their legendary strength and bravery, and although he too had once laughed at their absurdity, something about those old stories stuck with him. A part of him began to wonder if perhaps there was more to them than anyone realized. One night, while alone in his quarters, Kier accessed the deepest levels of the Seth archives, pulling up records from long-forgotten civilizations. He traced the ancient accounts, all leading back to one thing: the humans, a fleet so powerful it was said to have destroyed entire armies and vanished without a trace. The elders had dismissed the humans as a myth, but what if they were wrong? What if the stories were real? Kier's curiosity grew, and with it his unease. He began to track the mysterious signals with greater intensity. The more he searched, the more evidence he uncovered. The signals were not random. They were coming from the very edge of death-controlled space, from a place no known species had ever ventured. It was as if something or someone was waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The Seth leadership continued to ignore the growing threat, but Kier knew better. His instincts told him that the myths were true, that something was coming, something far more dangerous than anything the Tithe had ever faced, a force born from the forgotten past. One cold, quiet evening, as Kier stared at the star-filled sky from the bridge of his ship, he received a transmission. It was a coded message, a faint signal that had been hidden in the static of space. His heart raced as he decoded the message. There was no mistaking it. The signal was coming from a fleet, and it was heading straight toward Zethase. Kier wasted no time. He rushed to the command center to report his findings. He had the evidence now. The human fleet was real. But when he arrived, the senior officers dismissed him as overreacting. They still laughed at the idea that the humans were nothing more than stories. One of them scoffed, "We have nothing to fear." But Kier's gut told him otherwise. As days passed, the signals intensified. The fleet that had once been a myth was now drawing closer, and Kier knew it was only a matter of time before Zethase would face them. The thought was chilling. Then, as if in confirmation of Kier's fears, the starry expanse in front of him suddenly rippled. A massive ship emerged from the darkness of space, a warship unlike any the Tithe had ever seen. Its black hull gleamed in the light of distant stars, its size towering over anything the Tithe had ever built. The ship was an unholy sight, its jagged lines cutting through the vacuum like a predator stalking its prey. For a moment, everything went still. The crew of the T-Fleet stood in stunned silence as more ships began to emerge from the dark void, one after another, forming a massive, imposing armada. The human fleet was real, and it had arrived. Kier's heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment he had feared. This was not a myth. This was not a story. It was humanity, and they had come for the Seth. The Seth had spent centuries mocking the idea of humans, but now they would pay the price for their arrogance. The fleet was here, and it was unlike anything they had ever seen before. The time for myths and legends was over. The humans were real, and they were here to challenge the might of the Tithe Empire. Suspense builds as the first human ship fires its weapons. The Seth officers scramble in panic. Kier, once skeptical, now faces the terrifying truth. Humanity was no longer a myth. They were a force to be reckoned with. The Seth fleet was in chaos. Panic swept through the command center as officers scrambled to understand what was happening. The enormity of the situation settled on Kier like a heavy weight in the pit of his stomach. His worst fears had come to life. The human fleet was real, and it was now bearing down on their space. Kier stood on the bridge of his ship, staring at the screen in disbelief. The alien armada, once invisible in the darkness of space, now loomed large. The human ships were unlike any he had ever seen. Their design was brutal, functional, and purposeful. Vast armored behemoths, their hulls were covered in scars from countless battles. They were not just warships. They were symbols of a long and brutal history, ships that had fought, survived, and emerged victorious. "Unidentified fleet on approach," the sensor officer reported, her voice trembling. Kier took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the massive vessels now visible on the monitor. "What do we know about them?" he asked, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at him. "Nothing, they came out of nowhere," the officer responded. "We can't get a clear read on their capabilities. It's like they're masking their presence." It was then that Kier noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. The human ships weren't moving like any fleet he had ever encountered. There was no hasty retreat, no defensive posturing. They advanced with confidence and purpose, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. "Are we ready for combat?" Kier asked, his mind racing. "Not yet, sir," the weapons officer replied. "The humans are still too far out for a precise lock. Their weapons are unruly." Suddenly, the communication systems flickered to life. A harsh, distorted voice crackled through the airwaves. It was in a language Kier did not understand at first, but the message was clear enough in its tone, aggressive, defiant, and somehow familiar. The human fleet was broadcasting a message directly to the Seth command ship. It was an invitation, or perhaps a challenge. Kier's heart raced. He had seen this before in the old human legends, moments of confrontation where the mighty were tested. The humans were bold, reckless, even in their confidence. Then the first shot was fired. The explosion rattled the Seth fleet. A bolt of energy cut through space, striking one of the Seth's outermost ships. The vessel cracked open like a fragile eggshell, sending debris spiraling into space. It was as if the Tithe had been hit by a thunderclap that reverberated across the stars. The force of the blast was unlike anything they had ever seen. The human weapon was devastating, designed for maximum destruction. "Return fire," Kier ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. But the Seth fleet weapons were slow to respond. Their ships were not prepared for such a sudden, brutal assault. The human ships did not hesitate. They were fast, striking with precision, each shot landing with deadly accuracy. The Seth retaliated, but the humans' armor was stronger than they had anticipated, and their shields absorbed most of the incoming fire. The battle quickly became a one-sided affair. The Seth fleet, unable to keep up with the relentless assault of the human armada, was faltering. Kier's mind raced. The humans were not only real, they were formidable. This was no myth. They had come, and they had brought hell with them. The Seth fleet was in disarray. Some of the senior officers called for an immediate retreat, but Kier knew there was no escape. The humans were faster, stronger, and their fleet was vast. Every moment they hesitated, the Tithe were losing ground. Kier's gaze remained fixed on the screen. The humans had deployed their flagship, a massive ship that dwarfed everything the Tithe had built. It was a monstrosity of metal and fire, a symbol of their terrifying might, and it was heading directly toward the Seth command ship. The communications officer looked at Kier, her eyes wide with fear. "What are we going to do, sir?" she asked. Kier swallowed hard. There was no clear solution. The Tithe had underestimated their enemy, laughed at their existence, and now they were paying the price. He could see the panic starting to spread throughout the fleet. The once feared Seth Empire was facing the unthinkable, an invasion by an enemy they had written off as nothing more than a legend. "Get me a direct line to the fleet commanders," Kier said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We need to regroup." But as he spoke, another explosion rocked the ship. The human fleet was closing in relentlessly. In their pursuit, Kier knew it was only a matter of time before the Seth Empire's defenses would crumble beneath the weight of this unexpected force. Kier's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the communications officer's frantic voice. "Sir, we have incoming. It's a message from the human flagship." The transmission was clear, direct, and chilling. "This is Captain Core of the human fleet. You have two choices, surrender or we finish this." The message left Kier cold. There was no room for negotiation. The humans had made their intentions clear. They had come to fight, and they would not stop until the Seth Empire was no more. For the first time in his life, Kier felt fear. He had heard stories, but this was no longer a myth. The humans were here, and they were ready for war. Kier stood at the command console, his mind in turmoil as the human fleet closed in. The transmission from Captain Kor still echoed in his mind, each word like a heavy stone dropping into the depths of his thoughts. "Surrender, or we finish this." The Death Empire had never known defeat. They had conquered countless worlds, and yet here they were, caught off guard by an enemy they had never taken seriously. Humans, a species they believed were nothing more than stories. Now the stories were alive, and they were terrifying. Kier watched as the human flagship, a massive black vessel, powered forward, its sleek design cutting through space with an air of undeniable power. The ship was almost impossibly large, dwarfing even the largest of the Seth warships. Its guns were already charging, ready to unleash destruction. "Sir," the weapons officer said, her voice tinged with uncertainty, "we've lost 2 more ships. The human fleet is too advanced for us to counter." Kier clenched his fists, his mind racing for a solution. He had seen countless battles in his time, but nothing like this. The Seth fleet had never been outclassed so completely. The humans weren't just better equipped, they were more efficient, more ruthless. They didn't hesitate, they fought like they had nothing to lose. "Initiate evasive maneuvers," Kier barked, his voice firm. "We need to buy more time. Contact the Empire's high command, we need reinforcements now." But deep down, Kier knew it was hopeless. The human fleet was too fast, too precise. They had already taken out 3 Seth warships with ease, and now they were closing in on the heart of the fleet. There was no room to maneuver, no chance to escape. The Seth were out of their depth. As Kier paced back and forth on the command deck, the tension among his officers grew. The once proud warriors of the Tithe Empire were beginning to realize the unthinkable. They were facing an enemy that could wipe them out, and there was nothing they could do about it. "We need to surrender," one of the senior officers muttered almost to himself. Kier shot him a harsh glance. "We don't surrender," he growled. "We fight until the end." But even as he said the words, doubt nodded at him. Could they really win this fight? The humans had shown no mercy so far. They had come for war, and it seemed they would not stop until the Seth Empire was nothing more than a memory. The enemy ships continued their advance. Kier could see the shimmering shields of the human fleet, now glowing faintly as they absorbed the incoming fire from the Seth ships. The humans didn't even flinch. Each shot they fired hit its mark, precise and deadly. The Tithe were already losing ships faster than they could replace them. "Shields at 50%, the navigator reported, her voice strained. "If we don't fall back now, we'll lose everything." Kier ignored her. "We're not retreating, we'll hold them here." But even as he spoke, he felt the weight of his words. They were fighting a losing battle, and they all knew it. The Tithe Empire, a race that had once struck fear into the hearts of its enemies, was now facing its end at the hands of humans, an enemy they had dismissed as nothing more than myths. "Sir, incoming transmission from the human flagship," the communications officer announced, her voice tight with fear. "They're asking us to respond." Kier took a deep breath and walked over to the communications panel. He had no choice now. The humans were going to make contact, whether the Seth were ready or not. "Open the channel," Kier said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. The screen flickered to life and a human appeared. He was tall, his features hard and cold, his uniform bore the markings of a high-ranking officer, and his posture was one of absolute authority. "This is Captain Kor of the Terran Fleet," the human said, his voice calm but edged with an underlying threat. "You've had your warning. You can either stand down or we will continue until your empire is no more." Kier's breath caught in his throat. The human's calm demeanor was in stark contrast to the devastation the fleet had already wrought on the Seth forces. He could see the smirk tugging at the corner of Captain Kor's mouth, as if this had all been expected, nothing more than another conquest in a long history of victories. "You have 2 choices," Captain Kor continued. "Surrender and we will allow you to retreat. Fight and we will destroy you. The choice is yours." Kier's fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the weight of every Seth officer's eyes on him. The fate of their empire rested in his hands. Was there any hope left? Could they survive this? But before he could respond, the human fleet fired again. Another Seth warship exploded in a fiery burst, its remnants scattered across space. Kier's heart sank. It was over, and yet deep within him there was a spark of defiance. The Tithe Empire would not fall without a fight, no matter the odds. "We will never surrender," Kier said, his voice hard as steel. Captain Kor's expression remained unchanged. Then so be it, he replied coldly. Prepare yourselves for the final reckoning. As the human fleet continued its advance, Kier knew that the battle for the Seth Empire's survival had truly begun, and this time there would be no myths to save them, only the cold, hard reality of war. The Seth fleet was crumbling under the relentless assault. The once proud ships, built for war and designed to strike fear across the galaxy, were now nothing more than sitting ducks in the face of the Terran fleet's overwhelming power. Each moment felt like an eternity as explosions lit up the void of space. The remains of their warships scattered like debris in a cosmic graveyard. Kier stood at the center of the command deck, watching as the battle unfolded around him. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was strangely calm. He had given everything to this fight. He had rallied his fleet and commanded them with every ounce of strength, but now the truth was clear. The Seth were outmatched, outgunned, and outclassed. "Shields down to 20%, the navigation officer called out, her voice tight with fear. "We can't hold out much longer, sir." Kier glanced around the room at his officers, each of them grim-faced and resigned. They had given their all, but the humans were too powerful, too relentless. The Seth ships were burning one by one, swallowed by the cold, indifferent void of space. The human flagship, the largest and most terrifying ship Kier had ever seen, moved forward with deliberate purpose. It was a massive black vessel, its sleek form cutting through space like a predator stalking its prey. Kier couldn't help but feel a chill down his spine. He had never seen anything so intimidating, and it was coming for him. "Status report," Kier barked, his voice strained but steady. "All systems failing, sir," the chief engineer replied. "We've lost half our fleet. The remaining ships are retreating, but they won't make it. The Terran fleet is closing in for the final blow." Kier's gaze shifted to the view screen. The human ships were in perfect formation, their weapons charged and ready for the finishing strike. The Seth fleet was all but destroyed. His mind flashed back to the first time he had heard the myth of humans. It had seemed so absurd then, like a bedtime story meant to entertain children. But now, facing them head-on, Kier realized that the stories had not been mere myths. They were a warning, and the humans had come to deliver it. "We're not giving up," Kier shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. He turned to his officers, determination hardening in his heart. "Get the last of our ships into formation. We'll make our stand here. We're going to show them that the Seth don't surrender." The officers nodded, their expressions grim but resolute. They had no other choice. If they were going to die, they would die fighting. The human fleet was closing in now. Kier watched as the enemy ships maneuvered effortlessly, their movements coordinated and precise like a well-oiled machine. Their strategies were flawless, their attack brutal. In contrast, the Seth ships were struggling to hold formation. They were too slow to damage, and the odds were insurmountable. As the human fleet unleashed another round of devastating fire, Kier's ship rocked violently. The hull groaned, the metal bending and creaking as the shields flickered out. The entire command deck shook and the lights dimmed. There was no escaping this. This was it. "Prepare for impact," Kier ordered, his voice steady even as panic began to ripple through the crew. The human ships moved in for the kill, their guns charged and ready to fire. But then something unexpected happened. A strange signal pierced the airwaves, cutting through the chaos of battle. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. The Tithe had never heard anything like it before. It was a transmission, a code coming from deep space. "Sir, the signal it's coming from," before the officer could finish, a new massive presence entered the battlefield. A huge rift in space opened up before the Seth fleet, and out of it emerged a colossal warship like nothing Kier had ever seen. It was larger than anything that the Seth or humans had ever created. Its hull was sleek, black as the void, and bristling with energy. This was no ordinary ship. This was the thing the ancient prophecies had warned about. For a moment, the human fleet, which had been moments away from delivering the final blow, paused in surprise. They weren't the only ones here anymore, and the new arrival was not like anything they had ever encountered. The massive ship powered forward, cutting through space with terrifying precision. It was moving toward the human fleet at an incredible speed, and it seemed as though the very stars themselves bent to its will. The humans responded by launching every available ship at the newcomer, but they were quickly overwhelmed. Their weapons bounced harmlessly off the new ship's shields. The alien fleet had arrived, and the Seth Empire, what was left of it, watched in awe as the battle shifted in their favor. Are we being saved?" one of Kier's officers whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Kier could hardly believe his own eyes. The ship before them was like something out of the old legends, a being of unimaginable power. It was unlike anything the Tithe had ever seen. The human fleet was retreating now, clearly outmatched by the new arrival. "Prepare to engage," Kier ordered, though his mind was still reeling from the shock. He couldn't allow himself to hope yet. He had seen the Death Empire crumble before, but he had no idea what was happening or why. For the first time, however, he saw a glimmer of possibility. The tide of the battle had turned, and with it, Kier could feel something stirring within him, a spark of hope. They weren't finished yet. This was far from over. The battle raged on, but the arrival of the colossal warship had changed everything. The Seth, battered and broken, found themselves in awe of the mysterious vessel that had emerged from the rift. It seemed like a force of nature, unstoppable and terrifying. For the first time in what felt like forever, Kier felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before, hope. But that hope was fragile, like a flickering candle in the midst of a storm. As the human fleet retreated, the massive warship continued its relentless advance, effortlessly pushing aside the human vessels. Their weapons had no effect on its shields, and their attempts at retaliation were quickly snuffed out. It was clear that this ship was on a different level altogether. The Seth commanders, still reeling from the shock of the battle's unexpected turn, watched in stunned silence as the tide shifted in their favor. "Sir, the human fleet is retreating," one of the Seth officers reported, her voice trembling with disbelief. "They're pulling back, they're leaving the battlefield." Kier's heart skipped a beat. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what to believe. The humans, who had been so ruthless in their pursuit of victory, were now retreating. But from what? What could possibly make them run in the face of such overwhelming strength? Why are they retreating? Kier muttered to himself, staring at the view screen in confusion. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. The sudden appearance of this new warship, its advanced technology, and the way it effortlessly dismantled the human fleet left him with more questions than answers. Who were these humans, and what had they brought with them? Kier had never heard of such a force in all his years of service to the Tithe Empire. As he pondered, the massive ship continued its assault, now targeting the remaining human ships. The few that hadn't already been destroyed were now being systematically eliminated. It was clear that this was no ordinary warship. It was a weapon of unimaginable power, and it was working with the humans. "Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the human fleet," the communications officer interrupted. Kier's eyes snapped to her as his mind immediately went on high alert. What could the humans want now? Had they regrouped? Were they preparing for another assault? "Put it on the screen," Kier ordered, his voice firm. The view screen flickered to life and a human officer appeared. His face was battle-hardened, his eyes cold and determined, but it was not the face of a man who had been defeated. "No, this is someone who has tasted victory, and now he is offering a strange ultimatum. This is Commander Ellis of the Terran fleet," the human said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "We have no intention of destroying your empire, but know this, we have come for a reason. The galaxy is changing, and those who do not change with it will be left behind." Kier's heart raced as he processed the message. The human fleet was not simply retreating, they were issuing a challenge. It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but it was an undeniable statement of intent. They had come not to conquer, but to change the balance of power in the galaxy. The Tithe Empire had been the dominant force for so long, but now it seemed they were being confronted by something they didn't understand. "What do you want from us?" Kier asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That remains to be seen," Commander Ellis replied, his gaze unwavering. "But know this, if you resist, you will be crushed. You may have survived today, but tomorrow is not guaranteed. We will give you a choice, join us or be left behind." The transmission ended abruptly and the screen went black. Kier stood motionless, his thoughts swirling. The implications of what the human commander had said were staggering. The Tithe had been challenged, and the galaxy would never be the same again. "Get me the Emperor," Kier said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "We need to respond, we need to prepare." The communications officer quickly began transmitting the message. But as Kier turned back to the view screen, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The human fleet had shown its power, and now the Seth had to decide. Would they try to fight it, or would they bend to this new order? As the seconds ticked by, Kier felt the weight of history on his shoulders. This was the turning point, the moment the galaxy had been waiting for, and the Seth were no longer the unstoppable empire they once were. "Prepare for what's next," Kier said, his voice firm, though even he couldn't hide the fear creeping into his heart. "We are no longer the hunters, we are the prey." The future of the galaxy and the Tithe Empire hung in the balance. The Tithe Empire stood on the precipice of an unprecedented moment in its long and proud history. The arrival of the Terran fleet had shattered everything they had known about the galaxy's power structure. The Emperor sat in his grand throne room, surrounded by his most trusted advisors. The air was thick with tension as each of them tried to grasp the gravity of the situation. Kier stood before the Emperor, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision that lay ahead. He had seen the power of the Terran fleet firsthand, its unmatched strength, its unyielding resolve. The humans were not the primitive, forgotten species that the Tithe had dismissed for centuries. They were something far more dangerous. The Emperor, an ancient and powerful being who had ruled the Death Empire for centuries, stared down at the young officer with a piercing gaze. His eyes were full of years of wisdom, but also of pride, a pride that now seemed fragile in the face of the looming human threat. Keith, the Emperor's voice broke the silence. You have seen them for yourself. What do you think? Can we defeat them? Kier swallowed hard. He had spent years rising through the ranks of the Seth military, earning the respect of his peers, but now he found himself in uncharted waters. The humans are not just another foe to be crushed. They are a force that has come to challenge the very fabric of the galaxy itself. They are powerful, Your Majesty. Their ships are unlike anything we've seen before. They're advanced beyond our comprehension, and their technology is beyond our reach. We can't defeat them in a traditional battle. The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. The Seth had been conquerors for millennia. They had destroyed entire civilizations, annihilated fleets, and subjugated species without mercy. To be faced with an enemy that could not be defeated by force was a reality none of them had prepared for. Then the Emperor spoke again, his voice low but defiant. Surrender, bow to them. The Death Empire does not bow to anyone. Kier met his gaze, and for the first time he saw the cracks in the Emperor's confidence. The old man's pride was starting to fade, replaced by the realization that they were no longer invincible. No, Kier said, shaking his head. We don't have to surrender, but we need to understand them. These humans, they didn't come to conquer us for no reason. They're offering us a choice, a way forward. We can resist, but that will only lead to our destruction, or we can accept their offer and try to learn from them. The Emperor's expression darkened. You would have us ally with them. You would have us trust these mythic beings, the same humans who were written off as fairy tales. What do you think they want from us? I don't know, Your Majesty, Kier admitted. But I do know one thing, if we don't act now, we risk losing everything. The galaxy is changing, and we can either change with it or we will be left behind. Silence fell over the room once again, the weight of Kier's words hanging in the air. The Tithe had ruled the galaxy for centuries, and even considering the idea of yielding power to a species they had thought of as nothing more than a legend felt like an unthinkable betrayal. Yet the humans were not like the other enemies they had faced. They were something different, a force that could not be ignored. After what felt like an eternity, the Emperor finally spoke. Send a message to the Terran fleet, he ordered, his voice firm though his eyes betrayed uncertainty. Tell them we will meet with them. We will hear what they have to offer, but mark my words, Kier, this decision will change everything. Kier bowed his head, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a monumental decision, one that could alter the fate of the Tithe Empire forever. The human fleet had not only proven their strength, they had forced the Seth to face their own vulnerabilities. The once mighty empire now stood at a crossroads, its future uncertain. Back in the command center, Kier stood before the communications officer, the tension in the air palpable. The officer keyed in the coordinates for the Terran fleet, and within moments the transmission was sent. A brief moment of silence passed before the screen flickered to life. Commander Elias appeared, his stern face illuminated by the cold light of space. You have made the right decision, Elias said calmly. We offer you a place at the table. The future of the galaxy is at hand. The question now is, will you be part of it, or will you stand in the way? Kier nodded. We will hear your terms, but know this, Commander, we are not surrendering. We are choosing a future for our people, and we will not be your slaves. Elias smiled faintly. Good, I wouldn't expect anything less. The screen went dark, leaving Kier staring into the void. The choice had been made. Seth would either rise to meet this new challenge or fall, just as the myths had once foretold. And Kier knew that the galaxy was about to enter a new age, one that would change everything. The Seth Empire had always prided itself on its superiority. For centuries, they had ruled the galaxy with an iron fist, conquering and subjugating species without remorse. But now, faced with the undeniable power of the human fleet, they found themselves at a crossroads, a decision that would determine not only their future, but the future of the galaxy itself. Kier stood on the command deck of the Seth flagship, staring out into the void of space. The Terran fleet was just beyond their sensors, its ships massive and looming like shadows waiting to strike. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, memories, and doubts. He had been the one to advocate for peace, for diplomacy, yet now he was not sure if that path was truly the right one. The Emperor had given the order, prepare for war. They would not kneel to the humans, not now, not ever. But Kier could not shake the feeling that their pride was blinding them to the true danger.